5 things all probate attorneys should know when dealing with clients involved in a wrongful death case or a potential wrongful death case. The first thing that you should know is that your client is probably going through the worst possible suffering that a human being can suffer. Losing a loved one is always painful, no matter the circumstances. But when you lose a loved one due to the carelessness of someone else, or possibly due to an intentional act of somebody else, it takes the pain to a whole new level. And what I've noticed with my clients a lot of times is they deal with that pain in an unhealthy way. Some of them turn to drugs, they turn to alcohol. I've had a client commit suicide because he just couldn't bear the pain. So the first piece of advice I would give to you as a probate lawyer is to have a relationship, a referral relationship with a grief counselor that you can guide your clients to, that can help them deal with the pain in a healthy way. This will not only help them deal with the pain, but it also helps build the evidence for the wrongful death case, because one of the elements of damages that your client may be entitled to is the mental and emotional pain and suffering that they've endured as a result of the wrongful death. So sending them to grief counselors is very important. The other thing is, it's helpful to not only send them to grief counselors, but also encourage them to consult the clergy members if they are religious. So clergy members such as rabbis, priests, pastors, whatever religion that they have, because generally people who have lost a loved one prematurely due to somebody else's carelessness, they're going through a crisis of faith, where they're asking the question, why? If there's justice in the world, why would this happen to my loved one? And talking to the clergy about that and dealing with that in a healthy way is so important especially at the early level of dealing with their pain and suffering. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, it's important as their lawyer to remember that the evidence for their wrongful death case begins accumulating as soon as the injury occurs that happened to their loved one that led to the death. And so it's important that they document that evidence, and that evidence is preserved so that I, as the wrongful death lawyer, or whoever their wrongful death lawyer is, can later on convey that evidence to the jury to really illustrate the depth of the suffering that the survivor has gone through. And so an example of how to preserve the evidence, one of the things I highly recommend is that there is videotape and photographs of the memorial services of the deceased, because a lot of times that videotape and photograph becomes some of the most powerful evidence in the subsequent case, because it brings to life for the jury that this was a real person, that really this loss has really affected the survivors, and that there's good reason for it, because the memorial service really kind of, a lot of times it shows what type of person the deceased was and how much that person meant to the people, to the survivors. So that's one thing, is the memorial service. But also it's important to encourage them to start journaling as soon as possible after the death of their loved one. Journaling is an extremely powerful way for them to document what they've been through, but also it's a memory aid later on when they're testifying about the pain and suffering that they endured because of the premature death of their loved one. It's very, very, very helpful. What I like to do is, I would really encourage you to have them consult an experienced wrongful death attorney as soon as possible after the death of their loved one. I do understand they don't want to call an attorney. They don't want to call a wrongful death attorney. They don't want to seem greedy. They don't want to seem like they're trying to capitalize on the death of their loved one, but it's incredibly important to do so sooner rather than later, because we've got to give them the guidance on how to preserve their evidence, and also on the pitfalls that they could run into. For example, you don't want them doing GoFundMe campaigns for themselves. If somebody else does a GoFundMe campaign for them, that's a different story. But definitely don't have them doing it for themselves. Don't have them posting, make sure they're not posting on Facebook or Instagram, anything related to the death, and they just really need to stay off of Facebook and Instagram or any other social media. It can only hurt their case. There are many other pitfalls that they need the guidance of an experienced wrongful death attorney and to build the evidence in the case and to avoid certain things that could cause damage to the case. The next thing to remember, third thing to remember, is if your client was involved in a car crash and they own a vehicle in Florida, then they have PIP coverage. Under the law, you have to have PIP coverage, which provides a $5,000 death benefit to the survivors, and that death benefit can be used for funeral expenses. It can be used for expenses paying, for example, the probate attorney. And then not only that, if your client is involved in a wrongful death case, then you, as the probate attorney, can usually you can get a 25% referral fee if you refer their case to a wrongful death attorney like myself. And those 25% referral fees can sometimes be literally hundreds of thousands of dollars and sometimes even millions of dollars. So the amount that you could get for a referral fee could be much, much more than you might charge, for example, for setting up the estate. Okay, not only that, the wrongful death attorney can pay for reasonable court costs and litigation expenses. There is a debate over whether or not you as the probate attorney can charge both for setting up the estate and receive a 25% referral fee. That's something that you have to figure out for yourself with the Florida bar, but the wrongful death attorney can definitely pay for the court costs and litigation expenses related to setting up the estate. That would become a cost in the case that would be ultimately reimbursed when the wrongful death recovery was made. Okay. Now, it's also important to remember that if your client was killed in an accident or your client's loved one was killed in an accident, even if that accident was the deceased's fault, there still may be a viable wrongful death case. And that's because of Florida's comparative negligence laws. I've handled cases where my client was definitely at fault. I've handled cases where my client, for example, at one point had fallen asleep at the wheel and had stalled in the middle of the interstate, and then a truck came and rammed him from behind. And we were able to get a multi-million-dollar recovery despite the fact that my client was the one that had fallen asleep at the wheel. That is an example of how the comparative negligence works, because we were able to prove that the trucker had plenty of time to see my client and had actually also fallen asleep at the wheel because they had violated the federal motor carrier safety regulations. And so that's why we were able to get a multi-million-dollar recovery. My point in saying this is that even if the accident that caused your client's loved one's death was clearly the fault of your client's loved one, there still may be a viable wrongful death case. So it's important to have your client consult an experienced wrongful death attorney. Okay, now the other thing that I think is really important, and I've noticed having done many wrongful death cases, is it's very helpful if there are multiple survivors. If there are multiple survivors that have a potential interest in the wrongful death case, it's very wise to encourage them to hire an independent personal representative. Okay, the independent personal representative is somebody that is not a member of the family, and is somebody that does not have a financial interest in the estate, except for to the extent that they get a tiny percentage of the wrongful death recovery. But it's important because it avoids so many conflicts. It avoids the independent personal representative has a fiduciary duty to represent the best interests of all of the parties involved. And when you've got a a family member that is acting as personal representative, it's just an inherently conflicting situation sometimes, and when the family members disagree, it can become a real problem. So I highly recommend independent personal representatives, and so I would encourage you to encourage your clients to think on those terms when determining who the personal representative is going to be of the estate. I've had really good luck hiring lawyers or former judges as the independent personal representative, and that has really avoided some problems in my cases. So those are the 5 main things that I wanted to express to all probate attorneys. I hope that you got something out of this. My name is Jimmy Fasig. I am the senior partner of Fasig Brooks Law Offices. I am a wrongful death attorney. If you would like to talk about these issues or any other issues related to wrongful death, please give me a call. My number is 850-777-7777. That's 850-777-7777. Thank you so much.